Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the title at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly LOVED, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, PhD in literature, and someone who is coming to you today to talk about the incredible Jesmyn Ward and her new novel, Let Us Descend. So I am going to just dive right in and let you know why it is that I think it's worth, a big chunk of your time to listen to me talk about this book, which is so incredible. The reason I read it wasn't so much that it was on every single list of the best 10 books of 2023, although that did, of course, catch my eye. But I was really wanting to read this Jesmyn Ward because I was so incredibly moved by Salvage the Bones. So that was a book that she wrote. Oh, I should really know the date or I should have looked up the date, but I did not. If you're watching the YouTube channel right now, I will flash up that date for you and you'll know exactly when it was written. I'm thinking maybe 2012. We'll see how close I am. Oh, also, for those of you watching the YouTube channel right now, I actually really am gonna just ask you for a minute here to admire this sweater. This is a sweater that I have knit, and honestly, I think I have reached a new plateau of like professional knitting. I mean, I'm not a professional knitter because no one has ever paid me, but what's happened is I honestly think this sweater is like so pro looking that nobody compliments me on it. Usually if you can tell a sweater's home knit, somebody will be like, oh, I love your sweater. And I'll be like, oh, thank you, I made it. But in this case, no one is saying anything. You can't really see it. I'm going to bring this little lamp close. Look at that. Look at this pro. And I will also say that I shaped the sleeves so that they would be, skinnier and like would fit my arms a little bit better than the pattern, which was super oversized. And one of them is shorter and tighter than the other, but no problem. Nobody seems to be noticing that either. So back to the much more important task at hand. I wanted to read this new novel because Salvage the Bones was in fact so important to me. So that was a voice that we really needed to hear. This is just right out of my shitty memory, so I may be wrong about this, but I think it was a 13-year-old girl who was telling her story in the first person, and it was very much about the effect of Hurricane Katrina on her family. It was so, so moving. It also was a rewriting of Medea, of the myth of Medea, which I honestly didn't know anything about at the time, and I actually can't remember much. I feel like she sacrifices her brother off the end of a ship and like maybe eats all of her children. I think she does. So it was a rewriting of this very important myth. And Ward said at one point that it was infuriating to her that so many white writers, particularly white male writers, were able to just rewrite these classics and were able to really access these kind of huge stories, these mythological stories that have been, in the ether forever and ever. When Black women did that, they were sort of marginalized, or they were expected to talk about, only their experience and not so much about these much larger themes that are coming through, because they have endured all of these years since the days of classical mythology. So I really loved the idea of the rewriting of Medea. I did have to do some research because I did not know it. I'm not a mythology kind of gal. So I really loved that book, Salvage the Bones, and was very excited about reading this one. So I also was very interested because I read that it was a rewriting of Dante's Divine Comedy. And I was really interested to see how she was going to do that. And we're going to talk about that. Actually, we're going to talk about that later. Not right now. So I was really interested in how she was going to do this rewriting of Dante. I was also interested in the evolution of her prose. She's 47 now, I think. So I was interested to see both how similar and how different the writing was going to feel this time. I also was interested in her writing about a different era. So obviously if she's writing about Katrina, that's in the 21st century. And this was set during enslavement. So you have obviously a very different, and I was really interested to see how she handled that. I also had just assumed partially from the title of the book and also this rewriting of the Divine Comedy, which I did know is like, somebody's descent into hell, and Let Us Descend certainly echoes that. I was interested to know how she was going to handle just the relentlessness of the idea of a descent into hell. And it made a lot of sense to me that you would talk about enslavement in those terms, but I was really curious to see how she was going to pull it off and not have it just be like so painful for the reader the whole entire time. But if she hadn't had any kind of redemption at the end, that would have been fine. But I was interested in how she was going to pull that off. And part of my interest, of course, lay in the fact that this book is hugely successful. It's just like a gigantic bestseller. It's on all those lists, as I mentioned. And, I was interested to see how something that could be so relentless and so difficult to read was appealing to so many people. So importantly today, there are not going to be any spoilers in case you, are in the middle of the book or you're listening to this before you start it. I'm not going to spoil anything plot-wise. We are going to do some sort of close reading, some deep dives into some of the prose, but it won't give things away. And I'm purposefully not going to talk about the very end of the book because I really do want readers to feel like they can listen to this without without having the ending totally spoiled. I also don't think it's an ending that we need to dig too deeply into because she handles it so beautifully and it's such a great extension from what else she has done in the novel that I don't think you need me to like help you parse the ending. Okay, an agenda. For those of you who love agendas. First, we'll do a quick bio of Jesmyn Ward. Then we will dive in, talk about the title, talk about the chapter titles, which are masterful, and talk about the scope of the novel. We're going to talk about narrative voice. We're going to talk about Dante, and then figurative language. So figurative language is very, very important in the book, and we're gonna talk about why that is. Figurative language is simply language that is doing more than simply what the words are saying. It's conveying more. So think symbolism, think personification, think simile and metaphor, any kind of message that the writing is conveying that is like sort of above and beyond or perhaps below, because the words say something that means something literally, but they also mean something figuratively. So figurative language. And then we are going to talk about desire at the end. And throughout the whole time, we're going to be talking about how amazing the prose is for sure. We aren't going to spend too long talking about Ward. It's so funny. Whenever we read someone who is like still alive and relatively young, I'm always like, there's not going to be that much interesting stuff in the biography. But honestly, she had so many like degrees, so many advanced degrees from different schools, and so many accolades and prizes and stuff that I was like, geez, we're going to have to talk for like a little while here about like what a baller she is. So Jesmyn Ward was born in 1977 in Berkeley. And when she was 3 years old, her parents moved her back to Delisle, Mississippi. And she then came back to the Bay Area to go to Stanford as an undergraduate. She also got a master's degree in Stanford from something called Arts and Media, which I'm not exactly sure what that is, but she got a master's degree from Stanford as well. She also got an MFA from Michigan, which is really like a huge, accomplishment. Oh, I didn't even mention, she got a Stegner fellowship at Stanford, which those are like practically harder to get than the MacArthur. They're really, really prestigious. They come with money. It's 2 years. It's like really, really helpful in a lot of people's careers. And again, like very, very difficult to get. She then went on to win the National Book Award. She won one of those MacArthur Genius grants, which are like, the list of people who win that thing are just unbelievable. I mean, she is in some very, very heavy duty company there. And I'm really, I actually didn't know that about her, but it is so well deserved. I really love that. She's a professor now at Tulane and lives in Mississippi. My geography is so bad that I really don't even know how that's possible. Like I can't at all I can picture Louisiana like a boot. I can picture that, but I don't know where Tulane is, and I don't know where Mississippi is in relationship to Louisiana, which is really embarrassing. I'm blaming that on Mrs. Taylor, who was our 5th grade teacher and just like went rogue and decided that we were not going to learn the states or the capitals or United States geography. Like we just didn't ever learn it, which didn't seem like a big deal at the time. I was psyched to not have to memorize all that stuff, but like there's some holes in my geography. So importantly, though, I just listed all of these accomplishments and accolades, but I think it's really important to look at the ways that her life has been remarkably difficult. So, I think the word that I wrote here in my notes is tragedy, and then I was like, that seems, I don't know, it seemed like too sensational or something. I mean, this is a woman who has had some real difficulties. The first thing, sort of biographically or chronologically, is that she and her parents did, in fact, have a horrible experience of Katrina. I think they left their house. This is all from Wikipedia, by the way, so take it, as you will. They left their house in a car and somehow got stranded in like a field of tractors or something, and they were making their way to someone's house, and then that person said that their house was all full, and so they had a really, really difficult experience with Katrina, which I think is just really one of the main reasons why Salvage the Bones is so incredibly powerful. She also was going to do something different with her life, and then tragically, I keep wanting to say that word. Her younger brother was killed by a drunk driver, and she decided at that point that she needed to become a writer. I think she had applied to a nursing program. Again, this is from Wikipedia. But when her younger brother was killed and the person was like let go with just like, it wasn't just a misdemeanor, but it was not, was not a just situation the way that it worked out. So she decided to become a writer, and thank God she did, because really what she is doing is so important. And then she had a husband, and he died in 2020 of respiratory failure syndrome, which I don't know what that is exactly. I don't know if it was COVID related. I mean, that is horrible to think about. And they have 2 children. And if you look at the acknowledgments, which I always do because that's part of my sleuthing, she does talk about how all of these people had to really help her through grief. So I think this was a book that was written, well, we know this from the acknowledgments. It was a book that was written in a time of acute grief for her, which I really think does inflect the book in very important ways. And I hope that it was cathartic. I hope that this was somehow helpful for her, and that the act of writing was somehow helpful. I mean, honestly, I can't imagine. I don't know how she did it. But again, like, she just really seems like just an unbelievably, competent and brave and talented and intelligent young woman. I think she's like 45. No, she's 47. I think she's so young. I don't know why. I'm 54. She's not that much younger than I am, but like in my mind, she's like, I don't know, she's very young. People feel like they're getting younger and younger. We're going to dive into the text. Okay, so the first thing we always look at, and I'll remind you, if you want to be a better reader and get more out of your reading experience, you just need to slow down and pay attention. I also would really recommend that you write with a pencil. I know not everyone likes to do that because if they want to, lend the book to someone, that's really annoying to have someone else's marginalia. But, I find it is much more engaging. I am much more involved in the text. I never go back and look what I've written, but it does, I think, involve you more in the text. Obviously, if you're checking things out of the library, also not a great idea to write all over them. So I want to talk about the cover art. First of all, this bee is I find this so appealing. I find everything about this appealing. I love the sort of antiquated font here, because again, we're talking about an era that was different than the Katrina era. And so I was very interested, and it feels like a little bit old-timey and a little bit creepy in a way that's perfect. I also love that Jesmyn Ward has gotten to the point in her career where her name is right at the top and it's all in bold. Like, what we are selling here and what we are buying here is Jesmyn Ward. So she has become one of these names that really draws us in. And then down here, of course, we have the title. So if you look at this bee a little more closely, it's actually like a collage of a bunch of different things. And I looked at it, looks like mostly landscapes, but it's really kind of interesting to dig in a little further. There's some birds here. It's very swamp-like in sort of what we can see here, which I think is very fitting. I also did not notice originally that there's some little stars also that are throughout the throughout that are sort of scattered over the title, which I think actually add a lot. There are a couple of different times where stars are important, and certainly the idea of cosmology and how you are seeing the world and how you are conceiving, of the cosmos is important in this book in terms of like heaven and hell and, ascending and descending and spirits and God and all of these, Satan, all these different things. So I like the kind of nod to the celestial here. I'm also such a sucker for when they repeat something on the spine. So here we have this little repetition of the bee and some of the stars on the spine of the book, which I love. So I think the front here, the cover is great. I also even like the font of this bottom part here. The title is really interesting to me. So it's, again, like what it said to me is like, this is going to be pretty relentless. And it also spoke very clearly to the idea of Dante, which is very important. It's good. I think it's very good that she was sort of signaling that on the cover. The sort of antiquated feel of it, let us descend, feels sort of poetic, and it feels sort of grand in a way that I think is also very fitting. I also love the fact that it is let us descend. She is talking about that us there. That is a first person, plural, direct object. So this idea of let us descend, it's really talking about community. I said that in that tone because I was like actually sort of like piecing out what this was, and like I'm kind of psyched that I was able to just like deliver. So she is really kind of right from the beginning talking about this idea of community. It's let us descend, let all of us descend. And it becomes very clear who she is talking about and who this us is, almost from the start. Although it's interesting to think how many different ways you could interpret us, whether it's the matriarchal line of her family, whether it is all enslaved people, whether it is a certain, group, whether it's like her and Mary and Esther, or her and Safi, or her and Bastian, whoever the us is. But it's a very, really good signaling at the beginning that we are talking here about community. So we're going to open the book. I'm a big fan of epigraphs in general, and these are so good. Because of our time constraints here, I mean, honestly, I could talk for 2 hours if I dug into everything here. Wow, the reflection on my glasses here is terrible. Apologies. But I will say that we're not going to parse them, but the idea of having an interview with Rogers, Will Ann, from Born in Slavery, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project, 1936 to 1938. It's so powerful. I mean, that is also the us that we are talking about. And the fact that like, given the way that biographical information, that citation, is really powerful, because that is a fact. I mean, this is... we're assuming that she did not make this thing up right here, this federal whatever, narrative. So, you have this idea, and we already know that as readers, that this is all grounded in fact, which is really, really powerful. We then have a poem here, which I actually don't know who Nikki Finney is, and I did not look that up. But it was about a ship. It's about the Middle Passage, which is, that horrendous idea of people being brought from Africa to the United States, and that crossing as just being absolutely horrific. And then an excerpt from another poem down a little bit lower. So you have these three different pieces that are voices of people who are part of this community, part of this let us descend. And it's really powerful, I think, to begin with this. Also, importantly, Jesmyn Ward, she has said in the past, she's kind of a self-proclaimed failed poet. So she wanted to be a poet at some point. And you see that in her use of figurative language, which we're going to get to. But the idea that she is beginning here with epigrams that are poems is really very fitting, given how lyrical and how poetic her own writing is. We then have Let Us Descend. So we have this idea of Dante that comes right from the beginning, and we're going to actually look at page 33 briefly. So I love it when a title is repeated somewhere in the book. It's like it like kind of rings this little bell, and you're like, oh my God, wait, there's the title. And I always mark it. I always literally write like title, which is kind of a dumb thing to write. But so we have her learning at the door of her half-sisters in the house of her sire. I think it's very cool that she calls him her sire, because it's like, I mean, I thought of it as like a horse siring someone, in the sense that it was brutal and terrible. I mean, own experience of watching copulation by horses back in summer camp was brutal. So we have this idea of her being in this home with her half sisters and her father, which is horrific. Her father being white, of course, and her mother being black. But she is listening at the door and she is hearing them learn about Dante, which could be forced. It could feel kind of too heavy-handed, but in the hands of Ward, it works very, very well. I mean, it could be kind of preposterous as I'm saying it right now. I'm like, wow, that could have been just like, wait, what? How old are these girls that they're learning about Dante, and why are they teaching Dante's Inferno? I mean, that thing is an epic poem, like that from 1321. Like, this is not something easy to be reading, but it's actually done very seamlessly, and she's quoting the tutor sort of through the wall in a way that I found really moving and convincing. The tutor is telling the story of a man, an ancient Italian, who is walking down into hell. The hell he travels has levels like my father's house. The tutor says, "Let us descend," the poet now began, "and enter this blind world." So it goes on from there, but I really, I was just very, happy that she pulled that quotation directly from Dante, and it does explain why it feels kind of it feels like an ancient kind of mandate, because it's from this very important epic poem from the 14th century. So I'm a little bit famous for skipping over chapter titles. But I will say that because I know that Ward is such a lyrical writer and such a poetical writer and so careful about all of her images and all of her word choice, I found myself actually really looking forward to her chapter titles. And I think they're really deft. I think they're excellent. So we're not going to talk about all of them, but I really liked the fact that those two were sort of borrowed. Each one of them is borrowed from some point in the chapter in a way that really provides this beautiful echo, and you sort of are directed some way, and then you feel as if you've kind of arrived when you get to that part of when you see the chapter title, when you see it manifested in the chapter itself. It's sort of like you have arrived. It's really, I think, a very beautifully done series of chapter titles. Okay, we're going to dive into the actual prose here. The first weapon I ever held was my mother's hand. I was a small child then, soft at the belly. On that night, my mother woke me and led me out to the Carolina woods, deep, deep into the murmuring trees, black with the sun's leaving. The bones in her fingers, blades in sheaths, but I did not know this yet. We walked until we came to a small clearing around a lightning-burnt tree far from my sire's rambling cream house that sits beyond the rice fields. Far from my sire, who is as white as my mother is dark. Far from this man who says he owns us. From this man who drives my mother to a black thread in the dim closeness of his kitchen, where she spends most of her waking hours working to feed him and his two paunchy, milk-sallow children. On that night long ago, my mother knelt in the fractured tree's roots and dug out two long, thin limbs, one with a tip carved like a spear, the other wavy as a snake, clumsily hewn. This is such a beautiful opening. I read it a little bit at length because I think it's just so beautiful to get sort of lost in it. And also, I find it so satisfying to go back and read the beginning of something after we have finished it. So hopefully for those of you who have finished the book and are listening to this, it was really satisfying to take a look at what was happening in the very beginning of the book. It's really, really providing so much information here right from the jump. The very first line here, the first weapon I ever held was my mother's hand. It's doing so much work here. First of all, very important to recognize that we are talking about the first person. So in the Foxed page throughout time, we have talked a lot about voice, and we've talked a lot about it's very important to hear or to recognize which voice we are hearing, who is doing the telling, and whose story are they telling. So when it is a first person narrator, it's important to recognize if there's a political heft behind that, or if there's a historical writing of history that is happening. And I would argue that that is happening here. We're hearing about a young woman's experience from childhood until adulthood, as an enslaved person in North Carolina. I think on the flap it says that it's like either right after or right before the Civil War. I'm not really sure. I didn't actually get that far in my sort of sleuthing and my looking at history, but it's right around that time. So it would have been between 1850 and 1870. So we have this first person narrator, which is extremely important because we're hearing her own voice tell her own story. But we also, right from the beginning, have this idea of the mother's hand as being incredibly important. And this bond of the mother and child is just throughout the whole entire thing. That is a very important note that Ward keeps returning to. In fact, matriarchy in general is extremely important. And you get a sense of that just because the sort of the older matriarchs, in fact, have become deities in this book in a way that is very powerful. At the beginning, we only have this notion of the mother and the child, but we also have the notion of the mother's hand as a weapon. So the mother is this protective force, which we're going to talk about names later, but the mom's name is Sasha, which you don't, it's very subtle. They only mention it maybe like once. If you don't remember that, do not, don't beat yourself up. But Sasha is known as like defender of the people or protector, which is so cool. So we have this idea that she is in fact a defender. She is a woman warrior, and she has learned these skills from women warriors who were in Africa. So you have this really strong sense of matriarchy and of the mother as being very present right at the beginning of the book. And then I love soft at the belly. I was a small child then, soft at the belly. You can absolutely see it. You can see, that's all we need to know how old she is. I mean, I have 3 kids and I'm around, I mean, they're grown now, but like I've been around enough kids to know that like that's a pretty little kid who still has that kind of big belly. I think lots of times it's literally because their organs are like a little bit big for their cute tiny bodies. So this is a very small child. And also the idea of soft at the belly is so beautiful because it speaks to this innocence. It speaks to the youth, and it speaks to the fragility of this child, the softness, the fact that they are not hardened. It also weirdly, as I'm saying this, I'm understanding that, if you're soft at the belly, potentially that belly is like protruding a little bit. So you're maybe even presaging the idea that this child will one day go on to be pregnant and go on to have her own children. I think that's kind of a deep interpretation. I'm not really sure that's what Ward was intending, but the idea of vulnerability is certainly there. It's really, really beautiful. So we find out that they're in Carolina, which I just like totally didn't get that. In my mind, I was like, they're definitely north of Louisiana, but that's like pretty easy to be north of Louisiana because it's down, on the coast there. But they're, in fact, Carolina. I don't know which one. And then we have, importantly, right in the middle of this initial paragraph, the idea of her sire, her father. She never calls him father, always calls him sire, which I think it does have that sort of distancing effect, which I think is very effective. But it also... And actually, sire, there's like a weird, it's like an antiquated idea, like that idea of, oh, sire, like a knightly, courtly kind of thing. But I think it's probably meant more in like a siring, like the verb, and in that case, to me, it sounds very kind of equine. But we learn about this cream-colored house, which really says so much. When we talk about figurative language, we're going to talk about the importance of the house. But for any of you out there who are like trying to, have some general reading tips, whenever you come to a house in literature, pay attention, because any writer worth her salt is going to make that house into an important reflection of the state of whoever is living there. So, if you have, the eaves are all, falling down and it's unpainted and it's not well kept, all of that kind of stuff, then you have a sense that whoever's living in there is kind of falling apart. I mean, it's very obvious in some way, but it's cool if the person does it right. So here, this idea of far from my sire's rambling cream house that sits beyond the rice fields, you have this idea of cream, of course, which is pointing right away to the idea of light and dark. You also have the idea of like cream of the crop. You also have idea of like, like the rising of the cream. You also have the idea of milking cows. It's so multivalent and so beautifully done and so economical. It's a rambling cream house. It's there's something luxurious about cream. It's just really a very artful and very economical way to describe this house. And then the milk sallow children, there's honestly so much to say, even about this, like just like this one paragraph at the beginning here. You again, all of this ideas of cream and milk, it's making me think of lactation. It's making me think of milking cows and labor and female labor and female domestication, female cows as being domesticated and used in ways that they don't have control over, in much the way that the enslaved also were held against their will and were used as laborers, used as domestic labor, domestic stock, if you will, in ways that's absolutely horrific. All of that is kind of is emerging with this idea of cream and also milk sallow children. This difference between the paunchy children and the soft-bellied narrator is really so, it's another thing that's incredibly well done. And you do get the sense too, those children are white. We don't know where their mom is. Apparently she's gone. I think maybe we hear that she dies, but I literally finished this book like yesterday and I don't remember. So there's my memory for you. But she is not present. And in fact, we do know that this sire raped Sasha enough times that she did in fact end up with our narrator. And then of course, this masterful paragraph is ending with the idea of the two of them becoming armed. This idea of the mom as giving this weapon to her child. So not only are her fingers blades, but in fact, she is arming her child. And in fact, arming her child, who is a girl, with something that is very phallic, this idea of a spear. So you have this sense of them as being warrior women, as being very competent, as being fearless and ferocious and armed, and also adapting to a way of life that's absolutely unthinkable. So this beginning here, Mama's Bladed Hands, again, is the chapter title. And then that first paragraph, unbelievably great. So we're going to move on from there to talk about the narrative voice. Again, this I think is one of the real strengths of this novel. We've already talked a little bit about the importance of the first person here, this idea that we have this young narrator who, is going to talk about her entire life, well, not entire lifespan, but, much of all of her childhood, her youth, and, well, not in like belabored terms, but the scope of the novel is such that we are moving from her as a very small, soft-bellied child to, someone who is almost 20. At one point, she says not yet 20. So we have to assume, she's in her early 20s. So really into adulthood. The scope of the novel is very impressive. And we have her voice throughout, which is extremely important. And I really love a lot of it. I think it really, it's important to hear this story told from this person. I will say that there were a couple of times that were a little bit awkward for me. There just were a couple of moments where I had a kind of a disjuncture between the voice of the narrator when this was sort of like this omniscient, beautifully lyrical, poetical kind of, narrator. And then we would go into the dialogue, and then it felt like a shift. So there was a little bit of a disjuncture there for me, which I found a little bit distracting at times, but really like certainly not a very large problem. Occasionally, I also had, I would feel like a little jarred by some of the diction. So there were times when she chose words during the sort of omniscient parts, a lot of use of figurative language and is omniscient and is like a much wider scope. It's in tune with the spirits and it's in tune with Dante. All of that kind of like not the quotation parts, but what the narrator is actually saying as a narrator. Every once in a while, there would be a word that seemed so far out of the vocabulary of the person. I have to say, she used the word abrade 3 times. And I was like, oh gosh, like it just seems like too many times to be using abrade. So occasionally there would be something like that, like almost like an SAT word, which is what we used to call them back in the day. Like these words that are really not very much in the parlance anymore. And part of me was like, the word seemed so like technical or just kind of like a little bit jarring. But for the most part, we have this beautiful omniscient narrator who is really able to keep control of a lot of elements as we are getting into, the idea of the spirit world, the idea of the matriarchy, remembering her mother, evoking all of these women. I mean, it's really deft to have a first-person narrator who can, in fact, sort of summon and describe and bring to life all of these different characters. A lot of the dialogue is really good, and it's one of the main ways that we are, hearing the voices and finding out about the other characters. And I found it very convincing and very strong. Happily, she's sort of paring all of that down so that the dialogue feels very impactful and very well chosen, which is just really excellent. I want to look at page 140 at some of the excellence of this narrator. This is one of these examples. It's a little bit later in the book, of course, but I don't think it's giving too much away. And it's important here to think about this first person idea, the idea of I here, but also this idea of we, this idea of how beautifully and consistently she moves from the first person singular to the first person plural, which you can understand why that is important. This is not just her story, it is the story of her community. I drink more water, and I, Esther's sharp collarbone, thin as a paring knife. I look at the long line of Mary's neck, and I know all of them is starving. We work anyhow. We fold and lift and haul and darn and light and rip and set. On our trips back and forth to the well, to the river, we bring water to the fields where the people are bent over the sugar cane. It already looks taller than it was yesterday, shooting skyward under the late flush of summer. I have never seen fields spread so far, and I have never seen so many people bending to work in them. So this is such a beautiful evocation, and I love, again, some of the lyrical nature of the prose is simply the syntax. So this idea here where she's repeating the and, I mean, it would be kind of more standard to have commas in between all of these things that they're doing, but all of the ands in between those actions, they sort of rarefy them, and they make us slow down and really kind of focus on each one, because each one is given sort of the same weight. So when she's describing that we lift and haul and darn and light and rip and set, it's so beautiful. It also is sort of encompassing all of these different domestic tasks that they're having to do. It's talking about this accumulation and this fatigue. It's so well done. So if we keep going in this paragraph, there's actually a good example of this kind of diction, this kind of word choice that brought me a little bit out of the text. And I mean, as a writer, you never want your reader brought out of the text. You want them to be in the flow, and you want them to stay into it and not be like, wait, this word seems like a little bit out of voice. So here we have her continuing. She's talking about all of the people working in the field. Their backs, curved and dark as a scuttle of beetles. The air redolent with manure. That's the word, redolent. I mean, that is actually literally like an SAT word that we had to learn. And it's a very cool word, but redolent of manure, it just seemed not really necessary. It seemed to me like a shift in diction that I was like, why are we doing this? Older people and children are weeding the fields, wading through ankle-deep mud. No one looks up to the blue expanse where Azza floats and watches with her arms aloft, setting the leaves of the trees to clapping. I loved that. This is figurative language here. The idea of setting the trees to clapping, that's an example of personification. And it's important when we note these examples of something like figurative language to say, so what? Why is it important? Yes, it's personification. And actually, I'll give you a gold star if you can just identify things like personification and symbolism and metaphor and simile, all these different things. But it's important then to say okay, what is she doing with this? Because any writer, again, who is really great, will reward us. So when we think about why the trees are being personified, you have this reverence for nature throughout. The idea that everything in nature is also alive. It's a very post-humanist idea, which if you're interested in post-humanism, you should go check out my lecture on North Woods, which is literally like a primer in post-humanism. But it's just this idea that we should look at trees who, communicate and who support each other and who have these long lives and who have seasons and who have diseases. We should think about trees as being crucial and being part of this web of life that we live in, and not something to simply, that's inanimate that we just take advantage of. So there is this really important thing that she's doing when she is personifying the trees. And it was a noise that I could hear, like the idea of the trees clapping. It to me, I like pictured like an aspen or a birch. I don't know exactly what those are, but the ones that sound kind of metallic, or like kind of like clapping, a little bit like hands clapping. So this really spoke to me. And again, it's very important that we have this first person narrator who is able to, be in relationship with all the other people, but who is also able to see the trees and see, the importance in them. It's really, really powerful. Speaking of the narrator, she actually has two different names, and the fact that she had two different of the names, and then later when we had our introduction to Mary and Esther, I started thinking a bit more about the names in the book, and I love this kind of sleuthing. So I went literally like to Google, and I just was Googling, what these different names mean, and I was so kind of gratified. It was such a satisfying search. So Black Annis is, of course, her nickname, the nickname of Aris. Black Annis is apparently a boogeyman in English folklore. So English as in like British folklore. Apparently in Leicestershire, there's this idea of this blue-faced witch. And I wonder if we can read blue-faced as in fact someone who was of darker skin, who was in England during the time when they had enslaved people. It seems like it would have gone back much further than that, and I don't know, if they had Black people in Europe, like way, way, way long ago when folklore was sort of just beginning, which I can't really put a year on that for you. Apologies. But there is this idea of that person as being a boogeyman. So I like to think of this as like a reappropriation of the power of this creature who was this witch. And I think, witches always are having like a moment, which is totally oxymoronic as I'm saying it. But like witches are very powerful. Witches are women who have always, defied the patriarchy and who have always had these powers and these strengths, and they're misunderstood and they're, persecuted because in fact they have power. So this idea of the witch as being a boogeyman, it's really, it's speaking to her power. And I love the fact that Jesmyn Ward gave that nickname to our narrator. So Aris is a Latin word for ram. So I also like that. I like the idea of like the force of that, of sort of the strength in the idea of ramming through something. We also have Sasha, who I mentioned before. So Sasha is the mother, not mentioned at length, the name, but that is in fact very important because, as I mentioned, Sasha means defender or helper of mankind. So you have this idea certainly of her as a helper and as a defender. We then have Azza, and Azza means comfort. It's an Arabic word. So this windy kind of spirit who is following her along and who is in fact very provocative in lots of ways and wanting her to do certain things and supporting her, but also betraying her. That spirit comes from the Arabic, the name, and it means comfort. Safi, also an Arabic name, means pure, which I thought was so good because poor Safi, wow, was I rooting for her. There's so much beautiful desire and so much communion and so much solace between them that I just really loved the idea of her as being pure. She's just purely good and purely comfort and purely solace in a way that is uncomplicated and really adds to the pain of the first part of the book. Esther apparently is like an anglicized version of Hadassah, which is a Hebrew name which means hide, or it means star. So like hiding away, but also a star. And I love that. This Esther here, I knew it was a biblical name, so I was like, okay. And I went to my Google machine and looked it up on Wikipedia, and sure enough, the book of Esther in the Bible, Esther is really highly esteemed and is like a very powerful figure. But I loved the idea that she is about hiding away because, in fact, in lots of ways, Esther is forced to hide. And, I'm not going to tell you what happens with her, but there are ways in which she is, in fact, very much a North Star for people. And it's just a beautiful combination, hide and star. I sometimes wonder how writers do this. I'm like, do they have like a book of baby names on their desks? I mean, maybe. That's actually not a bad idea. We also have Mary, of course. And in my mind, I was like, okay, Mary is the like whatever mother of Jesus. And you have like the virgin whore kind of dichotomy. You have all of this different stuff. But, and in fact, very importantly, this Mary is voiceless. She is mute, and a lot is made of the fact that she does not have a voice, which is really a beautiful counterpoint to our, really strongly voiced narrator. But she does, in fact, sing, which is this beautiful idea of this sort of hidden, this hidden well that she has inside her of hope and solace and strength. And it turns out that Mary, which is also Miriam, that would have been the Hebrew, origin of the word Mary, of the name Mary, means drop in the sea from Latin. And it also can mean bitterness or beloved. So all of those are really beautiful. I mean, and again, like such beautiful sort of ways to color this character in the book. You might be saying to yourself, like, wait, though, I didn't know any of that, which is fine because, maybe the second time you read a book, you're going to like go back and look at the names, or maybe moving forward, if you're someone who's like really into, taking her time and digging into a text, you're going to head to the Google machine and Google someone's name. Maybe like while you're standing in line, you can just like whip out your phone at the pharmacy and just like, I wonder what the name means of the character of the book I'm reading right now. That seems like a good use of your phone. Okay, speaking of good uses of our phones, Dante. We're going to move on and talk about Dante. I say that because I was very tempted, of course, to go to the internet and look up the Divine Comedy and, sort of figure out what it was all about so that I could sort of map my experience onto it. It was very satisfying when I read Demon Copperhead because I know David Copperfield fairly well, and I had actually read it, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years ago. And I didn't remember it particularly well, but my memory was jarred as I was reading Demon Copperhead. If you're interested in that, if you like Demon Copperhead, I actually did a lecture, which was so fun to do, comparing David Copperfield and Demon Copperhead and sort of all the ways that you can enrich your understanding of the Barbara Kingsolver book just by listening, to some stuff that I had to say about David Copperfield. So I was going to do the same, but then I thought to myself, wait, most people are not going to do that. And I wanted to have an experience going into this where I didn't know any more about the Divine Comedy than I already sort of knew. And all I knew was that it was about a descent into hell. I did also know that it was an epic poem, but I literally found that out 10 years ago. I just didn't even know it was a poem. Of course, turns out it's from 1321, and that was like the main mode of writing back then was in fact the epic poem. So I should not have been surprised. I knew it was really old, but I did not know, in fact, it was from the 14th century. I knew it was written by Dante Alighieri, and I think that's how you say his last name. And I also knew that Virgil is one of the guides who does some sort of guiding down into the underworld. That is what I knew going in. And what I want to provide for you today is a little more, because I found that I could follow parts of, I could imagine, there are a lot of descents in this book. And if you think about the underworld, you know that we're descending into the underworld. And so, when you think of the underworld, I think of Hades. I think that's a river down there. It might be the same as the river Styx, or maybe the river Styx is different. I don't know. This is me just pulling out of my 6th grade, mythology, education. I was never really it didn't take in 6th grade, that whole mythology unit did not spark my interest in the way that it did for a lot of people. But I had some idea about the underworld and about Dante. So I could understand when we had, these shackled groups of people trying to cross rivers, and when we had these hellish experiences, and when we had starvation, and when we had fires, and when we had smoke, and when we had sulfur. There's a lot of smells of sulfur. And when we have, different experiences of burrowing into the ground and descending into the ground, water into water. Those to me seemed very Dante-esque. So I think there were times when I kind of got it, but it would have actually been, I think, a little more helpful for me if we'd had a bit more guidance from Jesmyn Ward. I really don't think it was necessary. And I think with Medea, we had actually in Salvage the Bones, which was the other myth that she rewrote, I think we were given a little bit more information there. Our hands were held a bit more, as I recall. So I think I could have used a tiny bit more in order to have like a richer understanding of how she is in fact rewriting Dante. So again, I did a little sleuthing after I finished the book, and I want to provide you all with a little scaffolding about Dante to just enrich your experience of this book. So as I mentioned before, it is an epic poem, and it's from 1322. Did I say, I've been saying 21. I think it's 22. Or maybe it's 21. I think it's 22, which is hilarious. That like it's like I'm really trying to decipher which year, in fact, from the 14th century this thing came out. Probably not that huge, a question. But in the sort of early part of the 14th century, there are 3 parts, in fact, to the Divine Comedy. There is Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. I totally forgot, if I ever knew, that in fact this is also about rising up, which really makes a lot of sense. I also, it makes complete sense to me that Ward would call this book Let Us Descend and not like Let Us Rise. I mean, there's a lot of, talk and a lot of sort of titles about rising. It would have been much less clear what she was doing, and I think much less powerful. And really, in lots of ways, the book is relentless, and it's really difficult to read, and it's really difficult to really sink into, because it should be, because it's a story about enslavement. So I think it's very appropriate that things end the way that they do in the book, but that really so much of it is taken up with this idea of surviving hell. So a little bit more about this. It turns out that literally Wikipedia said this is an image of how divine justice is meted out. And I thought a lot about that today, because the idea of justice, there is nothing just about this situation. And I kind of wish that I had known that, because I think Ward is kind of working against this idea. Like, if everybody who is like familiar with the Divine Comedy understands that, like, oh, it's all about like divine justice and like who is, who's in hell and who's not, then I would have an understanding that Ward is really working against that, because obviously all of these enslaved people who are living through this hell have done nothing to deserve this. So it's really playing with that idea of divine justice and in fact really corrupting it. And one way to think about that is like how beautifully done this idea of these spirits are. We have a spirit of the air, we have a spirit of the river, we have a spirit of the ground, we have all of these different sort of gods, which really, the idea of a monolithic God who's going to mete out justice, who's sort of like the Judeo-Christian God, is not really a part of this story. So I think like the idea of knowing that she's really working against, I think very effectively, the idea of how justice is meted out, that I think is a good thing to be keeping in mind as you are reading. So in the Inferno part, that is about recognition and rejection of sin. So again, I'm like, like the sin is all on the part of the enslavers here. Like, I just don't, it doesn't match very well with the Divine Comedy. Purgatorio is about penitence. It's about the life of Christ. And then Paradiso is the soul's ascent. So you do have, in some ways it really maps with the descent idea and some of these pieces. But the penitence, I mean, like, no one who is enslaved needs to be penitent. There's some parts about the Divine Comedy that I think are essential to the Divine Comedy that she's working against in some really interesting ways. So there are 3 guides, and in the Divine Comedy, there are Virgil, which was the one I remembered. He's like the Greek guy. And then there was Beatrice, which is Beatrice. Lots of us say Beatrice. Like Petrarch had Laura and Dante had Beatrice, but I like to say Beatrice. So we have Virgil, Beatrice, and then we have Saint Bernard, which I obviously I didn't even remember Beatrice as being part of this. Like she could have been in some other, poem that Dante wrote. But Saint Bernard is interesting. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I will think of him as somewhat of a parallel with Bastian. So Bastian, in my mind, was short for Sebastian, who was a saint. Interestingly, he's kind of like the martyred saint of gay men, because in fact, I actually don't even remember why now. He was shot by a whole bunch of arrows. And that's so bad. I mean, it was not that long ago. The reason I know that is because of Sebastian in the book that is by Somerset Maugham. No, it is by, oh gosh, I might remember it. It might come back to me at some point here. We'll see. So we have Sebastian here, who is, I think in some ways, Saint Sebastian, we can read him as like a Saint Bernard kind of figure. But I also think that you can think of the three guides in this book in lots of different ways, which is so satisfying. So instead of Virgil and Beatrice and Saint Bernard, we can think of Azza and Mama Azza and the mother, Sasha. So we can think of that succession of women as successive guides. We can think of the wind, this Azza, who's kind of the first, the first force that comes, and then the river, and then the earth. We can think of those three forces as other guides. We can think of Mama and Safi and Bastian because of their love for our narrator. We can think of those three people as sorts of guides and as people who are intimately involved with our narrator. So I really love the idea of finding these trios of gods, trios of guides throughout this book. Probably some of you are like, wait, did she really mean that? And I don't know. And probably not. I don't know. Maybe. Gosh, I wish I could talk to Jesmyn Ward. Wouldn't that be, it'd be so cool. But the idea of these guides, maybe she thought of it, maybe she didn't, maybe her subconscious was working on this, who knows? But I like the idea that as a reader, I am allowed to project my desire and my finding, my satisfaction in finding, all of these trios that really do map, I think, fairly well onto the Divine Comedy. Okay, we are going to talk quickly about figurative language, and then we are going to just wind things up. Again, Jesmyn Ward saw herself as a failed poet, and the reason I mention that is because she uses a huge amount of figurative language, and a lot of it is really effective, and then there's some times where some of her analogies, her metaphors and similes, are a little far afield. They're either the comparison is sort of too far. So the most effective metaphors and similes are essentially the same thing. A metaphor is just saying her fingers were mice, tripping across the piano keys, or her fingers moved like mice over the piano keys. That is such a bad, this is why I am not writing anymore and why I'm not a poet. But the idea is like or as is a simile, and metaphor just gives you, the thing is the thing. So all of those comparisons are most effective when you have two things, one of them, being something in the story, and then another item that helps us understand something important and essential about that item that's in the story. So when you have something that's too far away, or that seems too weird, or that kind of jars the reader, you're like, wait, what's the connection between this thing in the story and this thing of the metaphor? It doesn't work very well because the reader's like, wait, I don't get it. I don't understand how these are connected. Or wait, that seems a little too far away. So as soon as I was sort of taken out of the story and having to think about how the metaphor functioned, then, the metaphor is not maybe quite as successful. So I think there are times when her metaphors can be a little bit too, too far afield. But for the most part, it's really, really well done. So we're going to look at pages 42 and 43. So this is, again, relatively early in the book. The sun rises hotter, burns brighter, and as the day enlarges, my world narrows more, becomes this. My bones, pestles grinding in the bowls of my joints, becomes the rope rubbing my wrists red. When the sun is high in the sky, I realize we will not be fed midday. I know that we will not stop to relieve ourselves, that in this we are livestock too. We are expected to walk and drop filth like horses. So this is so beautiful. She has some metaphors and some similes. I love the idea of her bones being pestles grinding into her joints. So the mortar and pestle thing really works. I mean, partially you can just imagine that hip socket or the knees, just grinding against each other. Very, very effective. And then the idea of we are livestock, we are expected to drop filth like horses. Again, this idea of domesticated animals and enslaved people as being parallel is very important. And it's something that is subtly and not quite so subtly brought up through the book in ways that are really masterful. So you have this succession here of different metaphors. We have the her bones being mortar and pestle. Then we also have, them being like horses, and it still works. Like, having them that close together, like kind of all in the same paragraph. And she has so many, of these analogies, be it a metaphor or a simile, that you could become overwhelmed by them, and they could feel like mixed metaphors because there's so many kind of in succession. But part of the beauty of it is the reader very early gets used to this accumulation of them. And so you're kind of ready for it. And it's really beautifully done. It's kind of like she's trying out some different things, and some of it resonates probably more for some people than others. But it also is giving you the sense of all the different ways that you can experience, and all the different ways that the narrator would have been experiencing these experiences. Okay, we're going to look at page 135. For miles, the swampy forest swallows us. Several hours into the journey, the trees open to a clearing. The lady's house sits at the heart of it, a columned building that rises skyward, elegant and vicious as an ornamental blade. So good. So I love the idea, this first line here, for miles, the swampy forest swallows us. It's so excellent because you have all of these sibilant sounds, the swampy, I just forgot it. The swampy forest swallows us. So you have, even in forests, you have actually a weird double sibilant there, but swampy swallows us. You have all of these kind of longer vowels, longer vowels with these sibilants. So you have this sense almost of kind of the sucking of the mud and the liquid part of this swamp, and this repetition. It's so, so well done. So we have this really strong evocation of the swamp, and then right after it, and literally people being swallowed. So you also have the idea of personification of the swamp, the power of it, that it can swallow an entire person. So you have lots of different sort of types of figurative language here. And then we move to another house. So I mentioned earlier that the house is often, it's a good way to sort of think about who's living inside, especially if it's an introduction. In both of the cases with the sire's rambling cream house, and then here with this woman's house, we have a very strong depiction before we meet the people of their homes. So, be alert, reader. So what we have here, in fact, is the trees open into a clearing. The lady's house sits at the heart of it, a columned building that rises skyward, elegant and vicious as an ornamental blade. So it's really important here that it's the lady's house. We do, in fact, find out that there is she has a husband, but the idea of the lady, and we also find out that she has a mother who's living there. So you have another matriarchy. And in fact, it is the woman who decides when the harvest begins. So you have a very powerful group of women who are really horrific people, and actually really weird and just awful people. But you have this idea, again, of a matriarchy, which is really important. I think this underscoring of the power of women throughout the entire book is just masterful. But this idea, too, of this house that rises, and it's elegant, and it has these columns. There's something about the columns it's evoking, like a Greek revival kind of a thing. It's very, in some ways, it's kind of Virgil. It's kind of, some of the sort of Dante-esque, not medieval times, but that idea of ancient, buildings and reviving them. But also something about the columns is a little bit like, bars maybe on a jail cells. And also the idea of column, I'm thinking of vertebrae. So there's this idea of their bodies as being sort of owned the same way that these columns are owned. I mean, I'm really kind of riffing here, so take that out with a grain of salt. But I do think it's an important thing, this idea of this house as being very elegant. And then, of course, the idea of the house as being a blade. There are lots of blades throughout this book, and it is giving us this sense of the woman, she uses the word vicious, and it's a blade. So you really do have this sense of the power of this woman and a real foreboding, which is, like pretty obvious, right when we are arriving at this house. There's power, there's foreboding. It's really, really effectively done. The last element of figurative language we're going to look at is symbolism, and it is on page 236. It's a very brief description, but it really jumped out at me in a really interesting way. So we've just had all of the enslaved people survive this horrific harvest of the sugarcane, and we then have the narrator is watching watching the lady and her older mother, and they are having tea. The lady spoons sugar from a small white porcelain bowl edged in blue. There are gold dots all around the rim. A headache blooms behind my left eye. So good. It's so well done. So this is, I actually really have gained a recent appreciation for porcelain. So porcelain was imported from China. It was very hard for Americans to make. It was hugely symbolic of colonialism and this idea of oppressing other people and trade and commerce and capitalism. And it was a real luxury. So this idea of white porcelain, I learned all this from my daughter, who is getting a master's in art history, and she was the one who pointed out porcelain and this idea of white and purity and all the kind of racial coding. Like when you think of toilets, why all toilets, that kind of that white porcelain idea, like why are they all white? And why is white this idea of purity? Like why is ivory soap and the whiteness, and why, like it's this terrible encoded kind of colonialist thing about the superiority of whiteness and this idea of mastering, something like porcelain. It's thought to be very strong and hygienic, when in fact, like there's no reason why it should be white, and there's no reason why porcelain, which is in fact very brittle and very, breakable, why that is so desired. But so here we have this kind of double whammy, and we have this description of the bowl with the blue and the gold that's kind of one of the few objects that's really like kind of well developed. The other one, in fact, is the piece of tusk, the piece of white elephant tusk that I'm doing like this in my hair because for a long time it is kept in the hair of the women who have passed this tool down. So you have this white porcelain that is really standing in opposition to this tool, to this weapon that these women have handed down, and that in fact is very central to the story. So this white porcelain bowl, like the symbolism of it, and of course it's holding sugar, and this idea of all of the labor that has gone into it simply so this old horrible woman can spoon her tea. I think of her as being old. Maybe she's not that old. Her mom is still alive, but she seemed old. She seemed terrible. So I really was struck by this image. And that is just one of many, many, many. I could belabor this, but I'm not going to, because we've talked pretty, I think, exhaustively about figurative language. But there are many, many symbols that we could talk about throughout the novel that are equally kind of engaging and equally revealing the way that this porcelain sugar bowl. I want to close simply with the idea of desire. I mentioned this at the very beginning, but I think we have this masterful, really beautiful way that Jesmyn Ward is depicting the love and the affection and the desire that our narrator has. First of all, for her mother, which is this kind of ongoing thing, which is rare and interesting and so beautifully done. But then also her connection with Safi and her connection with Bastian. I mean, this is a little bit of a spoiler, so yikes, sorry. But take a second to notice the way that the desire and the love and the connection with those two people who are of different gender really is not, there's nothing sort of mutually exclusive about it. There are no questions. This narrator has all of this love and all of this affection and sexual desire for Safi. And then a lot of that sort of, that feeling, all of those emotions and all of those desires are very easily, sort of, moved to Bastian. And each time we have talk about for people here, but with Bastian, every time, he is sort of brought up, there's a lot of discussion, not a lot, but there's always mention of Safi in this beautiful way that her desire and her love feels like this incredibly consoling and incredibly important aspect of her life. And I thought it was just masterful the way that Ward sort of melded those two together, one sort of at the beginning of the book and one much later, in a way that just, it really felt like one of the real strengths of the book. So I want to end with that because I just found this book so compelling and so rich and so beautiful. And I hope that today's lecture has helped you, dig in a little bit more deeply to the genius of this novel. So now that we're done, you can get yourself straight back to the Fox page, find yourself something else to listen to. Happy reading.